Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hello, bestie. Hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So hit that subscribe button and join this community of amazing people committed to ethics, committed to compliance and human resources and making our world a better workplace. I am here with my good friend, Angie Gorman. Angie is the managing director at FTI Consulting and someone who has some really great perspectives and some really cool background stories that I think are going to really help us all elevate. How's it going, Angie?
Going well, thank you.
So why don't we dive right in? You have a really cool background and an interesting path that took you into this game. Tell us about how you got to where you're at right now.
Sure. And first, just to clarify, I'm one of many managing directors at FTI Consulting, but I happen to work in the people and transformation practice, and I happen to be our foremost person working on ethics and compliance as it relates to people in your organization. So
from my perspective, you are the managing director from where I'm sitting. Okay.
So how did I get to where I am and what I'm doing today? I am part of the strategic communications segment at FTI Consulting, which means all of the people in that segment were all communicators. I've been a communicator my entire career. Starting out, I wanted to be a graphic designer, which is a form of communication. And very quickly, within about the first 4 or 5 years, found that actually wasn't my calling. I wasn't as good as I thought I was. And more importantly, I was much more interested in the bigger picture of what we were doing with the various graphic design projects. So I moved over to the account side at the public relations firm I was working at the time, and started working with clients on any number of communications issues. And over time, I came to find that what I really cared most about, what I was really most interested in, was the work when we were helping employees to understand changes happening in their organization and helping the organizations and the leaders to get their people through those changes in a productive way. And I've spent probably 2/3 of my career focused primarily on the employee audience. And just a couple years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to work on a compliance project where our client really needed to get people to change the way they were thinking about ethics and compliance with a certain set of guidelines that they needed to follow, and to really start thinking about them as a competitive advantage if they did the work differently and if they did the work in a way that was compliant with what regulations were requiring. And so we did a program with them to help them get the right message out and to help get their leaders aligned around it, and to start to move the culture to thinking about innovation as an advantage as opposed to compliance as a burden. And from there, I've really been working on compliance projects ever since, and they have ranged from proactive activities like that to other proactive activities to introduce new policies into the organization, to things more on the reactive side when a company is dealing with investigations or the outcome of an investigation and they need to do a lot of remediation, which involves a lot of change management and often also involves changing the culture so that they don't run into the same problems in the future. So it's all been communications based, but in the last few years, I've been really enjoying applying that to compliance situations for companies and helping them make those changes.
And how has the application of these sort of communication principles been different than other experiences you've had as they've been applied to this thing that is sort of looked at as a burden in many cases?
It's different in a couple of ways, I would say. One way it's different is that our client is typically not the communications function. It's the chief compliance officer or the general counsel who is hiring us to help in this situation. And that means that they're not typically as familiar with communications as a discipline, and sometimes not even tightly connected with the communications people in their own company. And so that's something we try to help them with, because communications is absolutely foundational to helping them in these situations. Another way that it's different, I would say, is, you know, if we're on the proactive side of the work and, you know, they're not dealing with a big issue, but they're trying to improve their compliance program, it can be hard to get people's attention. People hear compliance and they don't get very excited, you know,
Right.
so we need to find a way to help with that. If they are dealing with an issue, if they're under investigation, they're trying to remediate things, often in a hurry, we can be forcing a lot of change on people very fast, which is difficult. And oftentimes people in this situation, you know, they're under stress and they're feeling anxiety because there's a lot going on. There's risk involved. They feel personal risk.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to, you know, help them through these changes and help them understand why things need to change at a time when they can be quite distracted sometimes, you know, with other things. So I would say those are the major differences.
So when you're coming into an organization, so let's actually go back to that first experience you were talking about. Part of what you said was that you had to get sort of leadership involved. Talk to me about that process and I guess first let's talk about how you were brought in. It sounds like you were brought in by the ethics and compliance team or by legal or something, but talk to me about some of the persuasion that you guys had to employ in order to get leadership to understand the opportunity that they had in echoing the communication sort of talk tracks or whatever you guys were talking about across the broader organization.
Sure. So yeah, we're often brought in, you know, either by, you know, the chief compliance officer or the general counsel or a combination of the two, sometimes by outside counsel, and there's always outside counsel involved. And I would say that is another difference in these situations versus other types of communications challenges. And, you know, it all starts with leaders. The Department of Justice has, you know, put out its guidance for what an effective compliance program looks like. And right at the top of the list is what they call tone at the top in a compliance culture. And tone at the top obviously means the right things being said and done, not just said, but also, you know, modeled in a behavioral way from the leaders from the very top of the organization. But we need to push it down below just the top leaders in the organization in order to get to everybody. But we need to start at the top. And oftentimes, you know, we have the commitment of the CEO and the C-suite. But now we need to take it down to the group below them because they are who really interacts with the people every day, with the customers every day. And we have to start often by making sure that they understand the current state of things. You know, what is the problem we're dealing with? What is the change we need to make? And why? Why do we need to make it? What is it going to do for us as a business to make these changes? And what is it going to do for us as individual employees if we make these changes? And frankly, in these situations, often it's also what's the consequence, you know, if we don't make these changes. You know, we're usually dealing with laws and regulations that need to be followed. And a lot of times people don't necessarily understand those laws and regulations. So we need to talk to them, not just about what's changing, but why does it matter? Why do we need to do it? And what's the outcome going to be, you know, if we do this well? And people want to do the right thing. And so they're often very, you know, open to this. But the first step is making sure that leadership understands, because every employee, no matter their level, looks up to the next level.
Right.
To see what are the signals that we're getting. You know, what are they saying? What are they doing? You know, what do I really need to do based on what I see them doing? So we need to start at the top and, you know, work our way down through the management levels to make sure that everybody gets the message and sees the right types of behavior happening.
So, I mean, everyone talks about tone at the top, I think, because it sounds kind of nice. But, like, it sounds like there's really a big, perhaps even a bigger battle to fight at that middle level or kind of the layer below. If you agree with that, how do we do that more effectively? Because I think at a high level, right, talking to a CEO or talking to somebody on the board that says, hey, we should have a compliant company, I mean, none of them are going to say, well, no, we don't. That's stupid, right?
Right.
But like the carrying out of that recipe, right, the cooking of that actual recipe is done on a sort of a much higher functional level by, to your point, those people a little bit of a layer down.
Yeah, and there is a process for that. And we often start by understanding what the current state is. And to understand the current state of compliance in an organization, we really need to talk to people in the organization. And we do that a few different ways. But usually one of the first things we do is talk to leaders, not just the leaders at the very top, but the leaders beneath them, and understand what their perceptions are of ethics and compliance in the organization. Where do they think it is successful? Where do they see that there are roadblocks, or where do they see things that they don't understand or they don't think are, in line with where they should be? Do they hear about it often enough? Is it part of their performance review experience or their employee experience all along the way? Do they feel like it's present in the company's values and the way people are, measured on their performance? So we get a good feel for, how do leaders perceive this today, and that starts to give us a good picture of, where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, where are the gaps, and oftentimes we take it more broadly to a broader employee audience. We do that typically in a survey methodology to really understand where those gaps are. Then we can take that to leaders to say, okay, here's how the organization looks today, and here's the difference between where you are today and where you need to be. And we talk a lot about what is a leader's role in making these changes. And it is communication, and it is also engagement, which is talking, face to face with your people, two-way with your people, one-on-one in large groups on a regular basis, not just one time. It's a lot more than just one email from the CEO that says, we must be an ethical organization, because everyone would say, well, of course we must be that. And aren't we today? So we have to get people involved in regular discussion, regular discourse about this in the organization, whether that's about, the concept itself of what it means to be ethical and compliant in our organization, but also some of the specifics. We have a new policy to roll out. What is it? Why does it matter? What do I need you to do differently? And then making sure that those leaders are committed to showing themselves doing it differently as well, so that when that employee looks up to say, what's my leader doing? They see and hear the right thing. And that can be everything from, did you complete your code of conduct training on time? I did. Did you? I want my whole team to do it. To, do you understand the law? To, we're going to have discussions about this once a month in our team meetings to make sure if you have questions, we know what they are. And, all the whole spectrum of things needs to happen to really make sure that it's clear that this is an expectation in this organization, and this is how we behave in line with that expectation.
When you're coming into these engagements, is there a similar playbook that you run, or are there similar gaps that you see in the teams that you come in and consult with from a communication standpoint? Like, are there certain fundamentals that, I don't know, that are just sort of easy for you or just foundational for you that you find yourself communicating repeatedly on engagement after engagement? And what are some of those principles that people can start kind of digesting or putting into practice in their own organization?
Yeah, some of the things that we see we need to do over and over again, and the content's always a little bit different because every organization is a little bit different, and it depends on what issue they're trying to address. But most companies that we're working with find that they need to do a better job of some very basic things, like making sure people are aware of the ethics hotline, what it's for and how to use it. That's often an early step. That in itself is not going to change a culture, but it is often something that needs to get done. We often need to ramp up the amount of communication that is coming from the CEO about compliance and from the compliance function. If the company is strengthening its compliance program, often by hiring new people into that function or new leaders into that function, there's an introduction to be done and explanation of what these people are here to do and how they help the business. So that's often part of it. And then, when you get down to communicating more straightforward things like new processes, there are always the standard tools that, we would use to communicate anything. You need to know what is your story? What are the messages we need to get across? What do people need to understand? what are the questions they're going to ask and how are we going to supply those answers. And then training, of course, is always part of it. Training is often the first go-to for compliance programs, and it's definitely necessary. Sometimes it's the only thing that gets done, and that on its own is not quite enough. And it needs to be more than just the standard once a year required trainings that you do on e-learning modules.
Right.
A lot of times we find we have to take the step of doing education, on the law itself. What is it we're supposed to be complying with, and what does it actually mean in terms of our day-to-day job? That education piece often needs to be done.
So that, so many folks are just sort of stuck into that. They're stuck in that like once a year loop. And then they wonder why their programs aren't as effective as they could be. Or they wonder why, why they feel like they're like treading water. What kind of tactics would you what tactics would you share with folks to like reframe or maybe reshatter the misconceptions they have about what effective training is?
Sure. So just like effective communication needs to happen more than one time, and it needs to happen in a number of different formats so that people remember it, so that people engage with it. Training is the same way. E-learning is a very popular vehicle for compliance training, but instructor-led training is important as well, especially if you're trying to educate, for the first time or maybe the first time in a while on the law. Having an actual instructor that people can engage with and ask questions of and hear examples from is important. And then reinforcing that, with smaller modules, whether those are e-learning or live things. We have a client that we're working with where, we've done a lot of the Law 101 trainings, which were instructor-led, and we've recommended that they incorporate ethics and compliance into all of their professional development programs at different levels. So people who are just coming into the company, people who are being elevated into leadership positions, things like that, so that they're hearing that ethics and compliance content, as part of the rest of what they're hearing. We've also recommended that they do roadshows. Every function in every company has its regular meetings, whether they're monthly or quarterly. Get yourself invited into those so you can talk about ethics and compliance with people one-to-one, face-to-face, and have some actual discussion about it. We've recommended clients that they do things like some clients call them power hours or office hours, where you just make yourself available for open conversation or questions in a short period of time. So there's all kinds of ways to take training content and turn it into something engaging and provide it in different formats than simply the once a year, I need to go sit online for an hour and go through this training. Those have their place, but they're alone and not enough.
Yeah, they're alone, and it's almost implicitly expected that it's kind of like this silver bullet that just like, cool, they did the training and then that's it. Some of the things that you were just talking about, I think it's interesting that they're even pieces of advice, because I think for some industries or for some departments, some of the things you're talking about, people that are wired a certain way might automatically be doing. What do you think it is about an ethics and compliance person or an HR person or somebody who really needs your services that prevents them from inviting themselves to the party, so to speak, or really pushing themselves into those conversations to make sure that this is out there? What do you think that is?
Well, we certainly know, and I know you've probably had a lot of conversations about this too with people, that, the compliance function isn't always welcomed with open arms, because they're seen as, the people who always tell us what we can't do.
Yeah.
And they're the people who, try to stop us from doing the business the way we want to. So they're not welcomed with open arms, and they're not necessarily inviting themselves in. So it's really about changing the perception of the value that you bring to the business, and sometimes changing your approach to the business so that you are viewed as a partner in making important business decisions, so that you can, avoid risk ahead of time instead of incur it and then deal with it. So there's nothing wrong with a chief compliance officer or people in their department forming relationships with other business leaders in the company and saying, hey, we have something of value to bring to your people, and I'd really love 10 minutes in your next meeting, or I'd really love half an hour the next time you do an offsite. And here's what I'd like to talk about, and here's how it affects your people and how I can help them through those situations. So it's really, just putting yourself out there and making sure that, it's understood that you're a valuable part of the business and how it runs, as well.
So, I mean, dentists have a bad reputation because they're pulling teeth out of people's mouths. I think most organizations or most leaders of other departments, if an ethics and compliance person asked if they could be involved, they would say, yeah, for sure, come in. I don't also think that most ethics and compliance people view themselves as like pulling teeth out of people's mouths. They're trying to help. They're trying to do the right thing and so forth. What do you think is at the core of this thing, and why is it so hard for us to, I don't know, overturn this label that we have? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think historically, compliance functions have operated more like experts in their area and less like business partners. Now, they have to be experts in their area, of course, but there's this transition to business partnership that a lot of other functions have already made. The HR function, for the most part, has made the transition from just technical expert to business partner and advisor. And communications functions, for the most part, have made that transition. Compliance functions need to make that transition too. They need to be subject matter experts, of course, on the law and compliance and what needs to be done to be in compliance with what the government expects. But they also need to sit down with business leaders and talk about, where are you taking your business? Let's talk about what the risks could be for you from a regulatory standpoint. And let's talk about how we can make sure that we mitigate those risks before they happen, and have those kinds of conversations as a business partner, as opposed to, here's the processes and procedures you need to follow, and if you don't follow them, then there's a disciplinary process and we'll deal with that. People don't react as well to that as they do to, let's talk about your business and how we can make it as strong as possible, and here's my role in doing that.
It's kind of an interesting cycle that I think a lot of people find themselves in, where this sort of reputation creates this self-fulfilling prophecy because it prevents them from reaching out because they're scared about the reaction they're going to get from folks, and they don't think they can overcome it. So then they end up implicitly sort of falling back into that, that behavior, or it like reinforces this stereotype. And, I mean, it's a hard enough job as it is. It's 10 or 100 or 1,000 times harder when you feel like you're just doing it all by yourselves, Yeah.
And, it may take a couple tries. It may take some diligence to get in there and form those relationships. But, once you've had a successful experience, and the business has had a successful experience with you, then talk about that,
Right.
Share that success story. Here's how we helped, and have the business person standing right there with you saying, here's how they helped us get through this or avoid this problem. And, if you can start doing that over time, you can start to change perceptions about how you contribute.
It's just, it's so interesting. Well, it's interesting at some level from like a navel gazing standpoint, I guess, but it's also kind of exciting because this next mile of impact that this function can have is really just understanding that this thing that's within us is going to be the key to our success. And that's just kind of humanizing our function. It's not about reading the law. It's about translating that law into actionable steps that somebody who presumably cares about doing the right thing, right? Everybody wants to work in a company that's built on integrity, and everybody wants an ethical workplace, all those kind of things. Those are all innate to all of us. We're not trying to teach a fish to fly, right? But engaging on that sort of on that tangent is really just about us as human beings in the ethics and compliance field, engaging in a humanistic way with the other human beings in our organization. So what?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, you can't expect people to understand what you do and what value you bring if you've never interacted with them.
Yeah, right.
because you just won't be on the radar. So
Yeah, it's kind of an exciting time to be in this game because, to your point, we're at this phase of really a lot of transition, right? You kind of talked about a couple of these other departments that have already sort of made it from the back channel or the back office function to kind of this trusted advisor or this strategic asset or whatever, and we're really on this precipice, and it's really a tipping point that's going to happen in each organization, and then collectively as a whole, we'll see, we'll be able to look back in the rear view and say, oh yeah, do you remember when we were viewed as, sitting at the kiddie table or viewed as kind of this cost center? I'd love to kind of shift gears a little bit in the same vein, I guess, but talk a little bit about, like, if this shift had happened 10 years ago, if this shift had happened effectively across most organizations, already, how do you think this thing that we're going through, that everyone's calling the Great Resignation, or that some of my friends are calling the Great Recalibration, would look different for organizations that are authentically engaging in sort of, effective ethics?
It's an interesting question. Just because what's at the foundation of the Great Resignation, right? Of the Great Recalibration, and is it about ethics and compliance, or is it about the way we live our lives, and how that interacts with work? That's a good question.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? How we live our lives and how we interact with work?
Well, just in terms of, I certainly grew up in a workplace where you were expected to be in the workplace, in the office, doing your work. And if you weren't there, then you weren't doing your work. And that's all changed.
Okay.
And, companies are, I think a lot of companies, the one I work for included, are in the process now of trying to figure out, what does that balance look like in the future? There are people who very much want us back in the offices, at least most of the time. And there are people who very much don't want to be there. And there are people who do want to be there. And, pretty much everything in between.
Right.
And there are valuable employees in every one of those categories. So how do we create a workplace that satisfies everyone's needs and keeps the business, moving forward and being innovative and collaborative and productive? And, I guess there certainly are some ethics and compliance aspects to that. There's some very technical things like, protecting data when people are so dispersed, working in so many different places, and compliance around things like, when you're working and how you're recording that time and all of those kinds of things. But, could we have prevented the Great Resignation? That I don't know about.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if we could have prevented it. I think there's a lot of companies that could have gotten out ahead of it. And there's probably companies that are experiencing it less than others. I don't know. I kind of tend to think it's all one thing, There's definitely some, I don't know. I guess the way I look at it is the cost of changing jobs has dropped a lot, right? And so also the supply of jobs from, an individual employee's perspective has skyrocketed from a work from home perspective. So all those things, basically lead to like higher labor mobility. And if the switching costs are effectively lower, if I don't have to drive somewhere else, or I don't have to budget different gas dollars because I'm just sitting at my table logging into Salesforce, or I'm sitting at my table logging into HubSpot, it's the same effective job. Then now I can start to prioritize different things. And, some of the studies I've been reading recently and some of the conversations I've been having have been around, there is a level of, my friend Ron calls it moral injury, that people have lived through. And there is a compromise. Like if you feel like you're compromising your values, or if you feel like your company's word doesn't follow its deed, or its deed doesn't follow its word rather, there's a dissonance that we've had, that I think the bar that, there's a higher bar that we'd have to get over in the past because the switching costs were higher, that now that bar has sort of come down. And I think most all companies, just to be clear, are experiencing this to some degree, right? Because there are some of the things you're talking about of, the hybrid thing and so forth. I think the strong force though is this ethics thing. And, for the last, 3-5 years, whatever, I've been talking a lot about how these new generations care a lot more about having an ethical workplace and an organizational purpose that overlaps very clearly with their own purpose, right? Because life's too short, because I have so much debt, because I'll never be a millionaire, because I'm still living at home or I'm still paying rent or whatever. All those things sort of were accelerated forward in the sort of, work from home era or the COVID era or whatever. Like that was like the great revealer, and it fast forwarded us 5 or 10 years. And I think a lot of companies are really caught on their heels. And so I just think it's all that. I think it's all the culture stuff. It's, very few people are leaving a great culture where they feel valued and they feel important and they feel part of something. I think most companies don't make their employees feel that way. And I'm sure that, for sure, most employees don't feel that way, irrespective of whether a company is sort of authentically trying to make people feel that way. So, at some level, right? Like, look, rewind back 100 years or 150 years, you were lucky to have a job where you didn't have to work 15 hours a day, and there weren't 9-year-olds falling into machines and stuff like that, right? Like, we've come a long way for sure, but I think we still have a long way to go. We still have a long way to go in our workplaces as we've sort of shifted into this new sort of knowledge work economy. And I think the organizations that get it and the organizations that are authentically engaging in the relationship that is, that exists between an organization as an entity and the people, which are other entities in the the employees, whatever, those people that are trying to like engage in that sort of constructively and authentically, which obviously kind of circling back to what we're talking about can only be done through actual communication, are going to find themselves way further down the road, or, in a way more secure position, or able to run a lot faster, or whatever the means by which they're sort of competing is, measured on, than their competitors who are just greenwashing to kind of use shorthand or just changing their logo in February or in June or whichever the month it is. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And, culture is, every company has a culture. Whether you put effort into it or not, you're going to have a culture. So, one thing we like to say is, do you want to have a culture by design or a culture by default?
Yeah, right.
And cultures by default are often not tended to, and not don't have advanced thinking put into them. And I think that was one of your points. Companies think in advance about a lot of things,
Mm-hmm.
but didn't really think in advance about what the impact of COVID was going to be, because we were all quite taken by surprise by it, even if we shouldn't have been. So whereas you look forward in terms of your business strategy and, what are the market challenges likely to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, and so how are you going to plan for that? We can do the same thing in terms of, what are the risks to our business
Mm-hmm.
likely to be? What are the risks to our culture likely to be? And you're right. I mean, one of the risks to the culture created over the last 2 years was, how do you hold a culture together when we're all sitting alone in our home offices and living rooms, instead of together? And a company who has put more effort into their culture before the crisis happened is probably going to be in better shape, through the crisis.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's probably right. And what I've kind of seen, I mean, I nerd out on this stuff, and we don't even get it right all the time. And my friend Adam, he did a post, and he was talking about how your culture is not this sort of thing that's etched in stone. Obviously, there's a temporal element to it, and there's sort of like he kind of likened it to weather patterns, and I thought that was so true, because there are these little pockets of challenges, and it's your culture is not a monolith. It's this like living, breathing, respirating, organic thing that's changing all the time, because it's really just the confluence and combination of all the feelings and thoughts and beliefs of people, which again are changing due to their own experiences and the challenges they're going through and so forth. And it's a very complex sort of lattice work of feelings and beliefs and whatever. But it's such an opportunity because it's that organic thing. You can really mold it very quickly, and you can make changes in it very quickly. And I think the amorphousness of it in general causes people to feel like it's very slippery and they can't sort of gain any purchase on it. So then it ends up just being like, well, I just can't. I have no idea how to like interact with that. So I'm just going to just let it be what it is. And then I think on average, it turns into that thing that you're talking about. Like everyone just is living in this culture by default. And they just say, well, I might as well just put up a values page and just kind of see where the chips fall or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some cases you can change certain things quickly, but in a lot of cases it takes a while
Yeah,
to
you
shift
think so?
culture. And it's really, it is driven from the top. I mean, I think about our own company. I joined FTI Consulting not quite 8 years ago. And the culture today is much different than it was 8 years ago,
Okay.
for the better. And it took some time to make that shift. And it was driven starting with our CEO, our global CEO, who joined the company about 6 months before I did, coincidentally. And he was very much a promoter of collaboration and, collaboration across silos and breaking down the silos. And we had a lot of silos at that time. And they've come down a lot.
Yeah.
But, it took time to do that. But there was a combination, I think, of, his and others' deliberate effort to change that about our culture. But there were also the foundational things that make our company what it is. And
Right.
those things are still there. And, so every company needs to look at, what are the foundational, non-negotiable things that make us who we are, that are part of our purpose, that, drive us to do what we do and dictate the way that we behave. Every company has those things.
Right.
And you need to understand what those things are and make sure that it's part of the employee experience every day, from the time that people are interviewing with the company through when they're onboarding and through their entire work experience. And taking active control of those things are how you help maintain a culture, even when people maybe aren't as connected as they used to be in the traditional ways that they used to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. You're kind of talking about like a real intentionality, and I just had this image of a chef who's making their restaurant. They're really thinking about every single element of the dining experience: the color on the walls, the music that's playing, the way the servers are dressed, the shape of the plates, all those kinds of things. There's an intentionality behind all those steps as that thing is, as that's being birthed from their mind into reality. But then there's also a maintenance of that all the time, right? Like, you see those chefs who are standing at the line and they're checking all the food to make sure it's plated properly and so forth. I think in our organizations, for some reason, maybe it's because the average business isn't as hard as the restaurant business, but there's almost like a set it and forget it mentality that kind of leads to this, culture by default thing. And the intentionality kind of ends up dropping instead of it turning on into this ongoing sort of process of maintenance,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it needs attention and care.
Yeah.
On an ongoing basis, and really that's what can help a company, maintain itself and maintain stability in challenging times, whether it's COVID or whether you're under investigation by the government or whatever the challenge might be. Knowing you've got a firm culture that guides people in the right way, can help maintain stability. And that's not to say that sometimes we don't have to make some adjustments in culture. If a company is facing an issue, you have to look at how did we get here?
Right.
And, what do we need to change to make sure we don't end up here again? And you will always find that there are, good, strong elements of the culture that should be maintained. And there might be some things that need to be shifted a little bit. And it depends on, where's your business headed? What is your business strategy? What does your business need to do? And what kind of culture is required to make that happen?
Right.
So
Angie, let's change gears a little bit. I want to go back in time. We're going to get in the Wayback Machine, and we're going to find a young Angie and give her some advice you wish you had 20 years ago, 30 years ago, whatever. What do you wish you know, or what do you wish you knew, or what do you wish that you picked up along the way that you wish you learned sooner?
Yeah. I guess one thing that comes to mind is, have confidence in yourself, which doesn't mean, be overconfident as if you know everything. but have confidence in, your abilities and your ability to contribute, and don't be afraid to do that. I know, there were times I can go into the Wayback Machine to a time when I was in the 6th grade, and I was in the band, and it was our first, public concert where all our parents were there and everything. And I was actually in the 7th and 8th grade band at the time, because I had switched schools and I had started lessons earlier than the other kids. So I was moved up to the other band, and it was sitting first chair, and I was very nervous because, I'm really just a 6th grader. And so we played our set, and we were asked to stand up and take our bows, and we did. And I was looking very nervous and feeling very nervous, like, maybe I wasn't good enough. And my father came up to me afterwards, and he said, why did you look so scared? Why did you look so nervous? You were wonderful. And I was like, because I was afraid I wasn't. And from that moment on, I thought, don't do that to yourself.
Wow.
You know what you're capable of. Hold your head up and show people what you're capable of. And, there've been other times throughout my young career, and even my not so young career, where I've had to be reminded of that lesson again. Be confident in who you are, regardless maybe of where you came from or what you thought your education was or wasn't. You know what you're capable of, and you need to show people that.
Oh, that's great advice. See, I love that question because it always leaves me with something that I can run with. Angie, this has been a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to our series that we're going to do together. So many of your frameworks and so many of the things that you bring to this game are really illuminating, and they're so actionable. And this is really an exciting time to be alive, an exciting time to be fighting the fight that we're fighting together. Where can people find you, Angie?
You can find me at angie.gorman@fticonsulting.com. I'm happy to answer any questions. You can also find me on LinkedIn under Angie Gorman.
Awesome.
And looking forward to the conversation.
Very good. Well, thank you for joining us on the Ethics Experts. Until next time.